Easter week in April 1969 shook the foundations of the city and the entire desert area. Young people from colleges and high schools throughout the state have been coming to Palm Springs during Easter week for many years. Usually 8,000 to 10,000 people visit the community, and in previous years no problems were experienced. But 1969 saw the influx of 20,000 to 25,000 young people, and needless to say, this year it was a different type who came. The youths, including the Hells Angels, began arriving late Friday, March 28, and continuing through the weekend. These scenes show the congregation of the young people along Palm Canyon Drive in the main business district. They sat in storefronts and on sidewalks and created problems for shoppers who wanted to get to and from various business establishments. Two big pop festivals were planned for Tuesday, April 1st and Wednesday, April 2nd. The first real evidence of problems brewing occurred at the first musical event scheduled at a drive-in theater on the easterly city limits. What was advertised extensively throughout the state of the event hired 35 off-duty police officers. Huge masses of kids began arriving for the event in the afternoon for the 8 o'clock program. However, once the kids got inside, the concert continued and was completed without further incident. Highway Patrol motorcycle officers were called to assist in traffic control of the concert. In just a moment, you will be seeing scenes of the massive parking problem at the mouth of Tockwitz Canyon, which served as a home under the stars for most of the youth who came to Palm Springs. Extensive statewide publicity also mentioned what a great place this canyon was to get turned on. While this footage was being shot on Wednesday morning, there was an emergency meeting being held at City Hall. At that meeting were members of the City Council, the City Manager, the City Attorney, the Palm Springs Police Department, and representatives of the Highway Patrol and the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Discussed at this meeting was what to do about the overall problem of 20,000 unruly youth, most of whom were camping illegally in Tockwitz Canyon. Of more immediate concern was what to do about the second concert, scheduled for 8 o'clock that night at Angel Stadium. It was the feeling of those present that this was more desirable than having 20,000 kids, many of whom had already purchased tickets, from rebelling against the concert cancellation and venting their antagonism on the rest of the community. Mutual aid was called, and by 7 o'clock Wednesday evening, some 300 police officers from 20 agencies throughout Southern California were on the scene. Shown here are the afternoon rehearsals for this event, which was police patrolled. Again, as was the case the night before, the youths began arriving early, and before the scheduled beginning of the concert, the entire stadium was full. It was estimated that there were 8,000 kids inside and about 4,000 or 5,000 outside who planned on getting in without tickets. Such attempts were not successful because a police picket line was set up around the stadium. Not being able to crash the gates, the crowd began milling around in a nearby intersection, on one corner of which there was a service station. They were attacking police lines and indulging in other types of behavior commonly seen in other riot situations. The general tactic of law enforcement officers on this evening was to work in squads and try to move the crowds around and out of developed areas. These are scenes on the inside of the theater where matters went off without incident. It was a different story on the outside of the stadium. It was at this service station that the only real violence occurred during Easter week. The crowd was causing extensive damage at the station. There was evidence that some were trying to get gasoline out of the pumps to make Molotov cocktails. A disturbing sight, you might imagine, for all the residents of Palm Springs, and particularly the service station owner. The owner of the station had his family inside, and he was deeply disturbed about what was happening to his property. After warning the youths on numerous occasions to leave, he wielded a .22 caliber rifle and ordered one youth fooling with the gas pumps to vacate the premises. When that youth did not leave, the station operator shot the boy. At this point, about 10 o'clock at night, after some 3 hours of really riotous behavior on the outside, this would, we feared, trigger the whole thing and really create some violence, but it did not. Law enforcement got on the scene, called an ambulance, got the boy out with relatively little difficulty. The boy survived his wound. The service station operator, using these films before the Riverside County Grand Jury, was able to build a case of self-protection and self-defense, and the jury refused to return an indictment on him. This was the only case where there was any weapon used during the entire Easter week. One of the most outstanding things that happened was that these young law enforcement officers from 20 different agencies who came in here, many of them arriving just during the riots and were thrown into the battle lines, were able to maintain self-control, and no officer at any time used a weapon on any of these kids, including nightsticks. The police eventually used tear gas to drive the crowd away from the stadium and disperse them. After the shooting that occurred at 10 o'clock, law enforcement made a valiant effort to clear the area. The operators of the music festival were asked to continue with the music on the inside so that the 10,000 or so kids there would not join forces with the 3,000 or 4,000 on the outside. That was successful. That night, about midnight, most of the kids outside dispersed and left, and at 12:30, police allowed the promoters to turn the kids out of the stadium. Following the stadium entertainment, the kids left, and law enforcement officers were all turned loose in large groups to patrol the streets, primarily in the business district. This is Thursday morning, showing you some of the damage that occurred at the service station where the shooting took place the night before. Most of the windows, cigarette machines, and gas pumps were broken. A damage estimate was set at $1,500. Fortunately, there was not extensive damage done throughout the city. This was one of the things that was most feared, that the youths who were unhappy about what happened at the stadium would begin to roam up and down the streets of the city and cause other damage and difficulty. Back at the entrance to Tahquitz Canyon, you can see the condition that prevailed there during most of the week, where the kids were parked all over the cone of the canyon. There was a tremendous amount of narcotics and evidence. It was completely impossible to do anything about the narcotics problem because police were mostly concerned with the huge numbers of people and how to keep them from getting out of control. The main effort of law enforcement was to try to hold the line, keep the kids relatively well located in one area, and not let them disperse throughout the community. Narcotics officers, undercover people who looked very much like some of these kids, were wandering through the crowds, determining what was going on. The photographers had a field day on Easter week. Kids were not at all reluctant to pose. Open use of narcotics, the sale of pills and marijuana, and everything else was going on all over the area. These people generally came to enjoy the sun, and apparently had heard about Tahquitz Canyon, and that's where most of them were bound. A lot of people you see here were sleeping up in the canyon during the night and coming down here during the day, or they weren't able to get a place to stay and they were just out wandering around. Many youths, as you will see as we go on, were obviously under the influence of narcotics or alcohol. It was really pathetic to see some of these young kids, 14 or 15 years old, both boys and girls, who were under the influence of narcotics and liquor. The first couple of days in Palm Springs, all the liquor stores were bought out, and there was quite a lot of liquor available. The youth had no particular compunctions about wandering around downtown. A lot of kids would go into restaurants and order food, and then walk out without even attempting to pay. They would walk into the banks and stores and urinate on the floor and do their thing in any way they felt proper. Generally speaking, the city didn't have enough law enforcement officers to take care of these individual incidents that occurred throughout the community. The city was mainly concerned with how to keep them under control and to get them out of town before any great damage was done to the community. With scenes like this in town, you can imagine what kind of telephone calls were being received at City Hall during the week from permanent residents who were really scared to death Most of the hotels reported that their normal tourist trade was leaving town in droves because people were deeply disturbed and concerned about what was going on. The appearance of the young people is a fearful thing to some of the community's residents and visitors. A lot of real hippie types were up in Tockwitz Canyon, a place in their minds where they could do their thing outside the watchful eyes of police. The terrain in the canyon is quite rugged. The sides are almost unclimbable. The city has had problems in this canyon for about 2 years, with small groups of people getting in, camping out for extended periods of time, and invariably using narcotics. In addition to the use of narcotics, the big fad was nudity. Apparently, this is one of the things that hippies go for. You can imagine what the normal tourist thought when they took a nice little stroll up into the canyon to see beautiful Tockwitz Falls and then ran across numerous boys and girls in the raw. The operation that occurred on Thursday was for law enforcement to mass at the entrance to the canyon and move in with about 200 officers and move the kids out. Mostly it was boys that were up there, young 19 or 20-year-olds. Most of them were from out of the area. In fact, the majority were not even from California. They were coming from all over the United States. But there were a goodly number of girls, generally 17 or 18-year-olds, who stayed with the boys and had a great time. An attempt was made to base arrests on nudity, but as you know, the courts throughout the state of California have ruled that nudity is not against the law. The only time the court would accept any type of conviction on indecent exposure was if people were doing something lewd. The courts have reviewed scenes from this film and released the people who have been arrested for nudity and indecent exposure. The youth brought into court on nudity arrests had no sense of doing anything wrong. They felt that it was perfectly okay for them to do this if they wanted to because they weren't bothering anybody. And to a large degree, it was true. They were not bothering anyone. They were not walking up and down the streets, breaking windows, or molesting people. They were going up into the canyon on their own and meeting with other people who felt much the same way as they did, and then they did their thing. The decision to clear the canyon of all the hippies was implemented by the Mutual Aid Command Center early Thursday. A Los Angeles County Sheriff's helicopter, used extensively for surveying the problem, was dispatched into the canyon. By use of loudspeakers, the youths were notified that the area was closed and those there were in violation of trespass. They were instructed to leave. In the afternoon, some 200 police officers were sent into this area. Most of the film shown here was taken by television cameramen, individual freelance photographers, and citizens who went up to take film. One of the things the city did not do, and which should be done, is to get something like this on film. Get somebody who will record everything that happens in an orderly way, so that when it's all over, there is some real evidence to show what really happened. During scenes like this, there's a tremendous amount of confusion. Nobody, including the police chief, the mayor, the city manager, really has complete control and really knows what's going on. Numerous city officials spent a lot of time running from one place to another, talking to people, listening to reports, going up in the helicopter, watching what was going on. But it was very difficult to have a clear picture of what was happening. At a time when things like this are occurring, one never really knows what's going to happen next. You're never sure but what you might be involved in a pitched battle. For example, when the city started pulling people out of the canyon area, we had all kinds of rumors that the Hells Angels were going to set up a battle line. They were stockpiling rocks and bottles and tire chains. We further heard that the kids that were being pushed out of the canyon were going to regroup and come back and attack law enforcement. There were all types of rumors and evidences that things were going to get worse rather than better. When we were involved in it, we didn't know from one minute to the next how it was going to turn out. We never knew, for example, when law enforcement personnel might lose their cool and have a shooting or some type of a violent reaction to what was happening. It's a very confused and confusing situation. That's why it is important to plan in advance to get some sort of record made by way of film on just what happens and delegate somebody to be the official historian of this type of event. We didn't do that in Palm Springs. We were fortunate to be able to get as much film on it as we did, but it all came from private sources, not from public photographers. Another thing that will be noted, and in these films we've not cut out any of the police brutality scenes because there simply weren't any. If there had been, we are certain that some of the ever-present television cameramen would have been able to record it. Another important problem during an event of this kind is to have an organized method of dealing with the press. We were deluged with phone calls and reporters from all over the country who wanted to get in on the action. On Tuesday, we delegated one person to serve as press officer for the police department and to give out all of the releases periodically. We had 2 press conferences each day during the week to report to all the assembled media people of exactly what had happened the day before and what was going to happen the coming day, what the plans were, and try to feed the news out in an orderly fashion. In the first couple of days before we got organized, the police department was just besieged with all types of people asking for information, parents calling about kids, kids coming in looking for lost friends, and reports of all types of injuries. With regard to injuries, it's important to do some advanced planning with the hospital. Incidentally, scenes you are seeing here is the Mutual Aid Command Center set up in downtown Palm Springs, some 20 minutes from the Tuckwitz Canyon area. Back to injuries, the Desert Hospital had a tremendous run of emergencies. A great many of the injuries were related in some way to liquor or to narcotics, and they had to treat a great many people in the hospital during this week. We hadn't thought about that in advance, and fortunately they were able to take care of it. But if we know of one of these things happening in the future, and we sure hope not, there are a great many things we are going to do to make it easier and to make it possible to have a more successful action. These are scenes of some of the officers getting ready to move into the canyon on Thursday for Operation Removal. We are very proud of the fact that the clean out of the canyon went without incident. As was noted, a sheriff's helicopter was dispatched into the canyon, informing the hippies that the area was closed and requesting everyone to leave. Later, when policemen were dispatched into the canyon, those persons still there were very politely requested to leave, which they did without incident. Only 14 arrests were made during the removal exercise, and all 14 were charged with narcotics or alcoholic violations. Officers moved into the canyon at 2 p.m., and by 6:30 p.m. the canyon had been cleared. The area was then barricaded off and patrolled for the rest of the week, and we refused to permit anyone back into the canyon. Cooperation from other agencies was great. The cities of our area were great in sending people. Under mutual aid, the agency employing the officers pay for their time. Palm Springs did house them and feed them during the time that they were on duty, but their overtime pay and any damage to vehicles or personnel was paid by the city that sent the officers. If nothing else, the Palm Springs experience is a great lesson in mutualized from the local level to the governor's office. But there are problems. In mutual aid, one of the big factors is coordinating the efforts of all these different people who will come from abilities. How does one communicate when there are 20 different radio frequencies? How does one control the operations of these people who are working on a riot line and who probably have never met one another before? How does one coordinate and communicate with city councilmen, judges, attorneys, and all people in the community who are going to be an integral part of this whole operation? It gave us in Palm Springs an opportunity to develop a tremendous respect for the ability of law enforcement and its ability to respond when a situation like this develops. In sum, the city learned 3 things. First, there is no way that a local police department, particularly in a small city, can have the manpower, experience, and equipment to cope with major civil disorder. It doesn't have to be a pot festival. It could be a labor strike or a civil rights demonstration or a disorder at the local high school or a fight at the football game. Anytime you get large groups of people together today, you have the ingredients of civil disorder. Second, the city also learned that we don't want any more pot festivals. It is very clear that the rock music extravaganza draws a strange crowd and creates very serious problems. We can't handle them in Palm Springs, and we don't want them. Thirdly, is a question of community values. It is obvious that there is a very great difference between established community values and the new morality of many young people. We've talked to college students about Easter week, and they say it was beautiful. The older generation in Palm Springs say it was ugly. Well, that's the story of what happened. A horde of young people swept into our city and overwhelmed the community. They terrorized the townspeople not so much by violence, but by repugnant behavior. They had their thing, and when the town rose up in indignation, they left without a backward glance at the littered city, which had been their bedroom, kitchen, and toilet for 5 days.
In 1986 through 1988, a group of rowdy teenagers took over the town of Palm Springs and sent spring break to the days gone by in the annals of history. How did things get so out of control? Spring break 1986 started out like any other Easter week in Palm Springs, warm and sunny. The business owners were looking forward to a brisk business from the 5,000 college students that were about to descend on the tiny town. The hotels were beginning to be booked, as normally happens for this festive weekend. Most had forgotten about the disastrous spring break of 1969. But this spring break would be anything but normal. Instead of 5,000 students, 10,000 showed up. These were not the clean-faced college kids the town was used to. This was a younger group, comprised mostly of high school teens and freshman college kids. Traffic on Palm Canyon Drive was so bad that it took almost 2 hours to go 2 miles. Day and night, the street was filled with drunken revelers. Students rode on hoods and roofs of cars and overflowed the backs of pickup trucks. Partygoers were everywhere, even on the roofs of RVs parked along the street. Soon the revelers began to amuse themselves by pelting cars at intersections with water balloons and buckets of water. This led to tearing the bikinis off young women who cruised by in open vehicles. Before the police could be called, the crowd had grown from a few hundred rowdy kids to a full-fledged mob of more than 1,000 rampaging students.
I don't know exactly how to combat this. Is a hard thing to do, you know. If people just come over and take over, it's anything that we've done to attract them. We've done everything we could to discourage them. And there's no way you can close the highway. Everybody said, well, close the highway. Well, then you close out all your other people, too. And there's no way of telling who's got reservations or what you can do. It's almost an impossible situation.
Police moved in and set up a staging area where nearly 200 officers, including help from the CHP and the Sheriff's Department, all in full riot gear, advanced on the crowd. Soon the parks and side streets were cleared, as was the traditional hangout Tahquitz Falls Canyon, where more than 200 kids were rousted after destroying the protected environment. Hundreds of kids were rounded up and more than 100 arrests were made. An interesting sidelight is that the Palm Springs jail only holds 28 prisoners. Offenders, therefore, were loaded onto 40-person sheriff's buses and driven around the back streets very slowly, while those in jail were processed and released, thereby making room in the jail for more. During the melee, no police officers were seriously hurt, other than some injury to their pride due to being constantly mooned by the partygoers. In the following years, spring break has diminished as the years have gone by. Cement barriers have been known to be set up, blocking traffic on Palm Canyon Drive. A city ordinance made it illegal to wear the popular thong bikini in public. Other limiting factors included bans on nudity, public drinking, and drinking around hotel pools after certain hours. Will spring break ever return? Don't hold your breath. Now that the police department has a cohesive plan, always in place during the Easter spring break weekend, the merchants and hotel owners look forward to a milder and gentler, much more affluent crowd. As former Mayor Frank Bogert said, these kids came into town during spring break with a shirt on their backs and $5 in their pockets, and they didn't change either one of them while they were here.